Make a couple of introductory comments to welcome Professor Ellen Amster here to our campus. Ahlan wa sahlan. And we're really looking forward to her talk today. And I was thinking, as I was preparing for this, where Morocco fits in on our campus. And I can only give my own point of view. I know there are plenty of people here who have done work in Morocco or in whose sphere of research Morocco falls. But I can really only give my own perspective. One of the things that we have here at the University of Florida is a number of Title VI Area Studies Center, including Center for European Studies, Center for African Studies, and Center for Latin American Studies. And the Center for African Studies, with which I'm affiliated, is a long-standing center, one of the, I think, the largest and best, right, in the country. And I think that we construe Africa in a much broader way than is sometimes done at Title VI centers, because we include North Africa, which is sometimes viewed as part of the Middle East, right? So if you go to apply for a Fulbright, for example, and you want to go to Morocco, well, then you have to look under the Middle East area rather than the Africa area, which is interesting. But I think that we also have a Sahel research group where we have a critical mass of researchers who look at from all kinds of perspectives, who look at the Sahel, so this area right south of the Sahara. And I think over the years, it has become very clear to us that the division between North Africa and Sub-Saharan Africa that sort of constructs the Sahara as a border is something that is really not viable anymore. And I think that we can maybe reconfigure and reconceptualize this area as what I like to call Trans-Sahara, which would include the Maghreb, the Sahara, and then the Sahel. And I know that for several researchers and some who are present in this audience, this is a reality. And I would just like to point out the work of Professor Abdoulaye Khan, who is here, who conducts research on transnational pilgrimages to a saint's tomb in Fez, to Ahmed At-Tijani's tomb in Fez. And pilgrims come from France and Senegal, people of Senegalese origin in France, come sometimes down to Senegal, and then they go on the pilgrimage to Morocco. And he's been researching this and these transnational pilgrim paths for a number of years now. So these are the kinds of activities, the kinds of ways of conceptualizing what some of us do here, I think that could possibly in the future lead to a reconfiguration in the way that maybe Brodel did for the Mediterranean, or later people did for the Atlantic world, in looking at this concept of Trans-Sahara. So even though we don't have a Middle Eastern Studies program here, we're really delighted to welcome you here, and I think there will be a lot of conversations that give some substance to this sort of Trans-Saharan notion. So I'm now going to pass it over to Bonnie Efros, who will do the formal introduction, but welcome.
Good evening and welcome, everyone. Thanks so much for coming out. I know April is that time of the semester when things get pretty frantic, and I know we had a lot of competition this evening. I'm so glad that you're able to join us for Professor Ellen Amster's talk this evening, which is the final lecture in our year-long series on which we titled Death, Confronting the Great Divide. So as all of you know, or many of you know, the Humanities Center has organized a speaker series to bring together historical, cultural, and ethical perspectives of the humanities to bear on a topic that broadly impacts our lives. And as many of you have attended earlier events in this series, you know that this year we focused on the topic of death and the way in which humans throughout history have dealt with the challenges both in the historical present as well as in the distant past. So as our series this semester has turned to more distant examples in the past, we've examined things such as how medieval belief in the afterlife, and particularly purgatory, affected Christian rituals in preparing for death. And last month, when Cynthia Hahn was here, we looked at the question of the relics of saints and how they provided, and the reliquaries which held them, a physical connection between this world and the next. In tonight's lecture, Professor Amster will offer insight into how the tombs of Islamic saints and prayer, touching, or the cures that were performed at these shrines might perform healing from a variety of mental, physical, and moral afflictions. Such Sufi holy sites, particularly in the city of Fez, which will be the example that she'll be looking at this evening, allowed Moroccans to construct a topographical map of the collective past. In other words, a geographical representation of the Islamic political community and God's presence in the world. And she's also interested in the way in which French colonial intervention in the early 20th century disrupted this political imaginary and thus affected the expression of this relationship between life and death and the role of these Sufi saints for the indigenous population of Morocco. But before I introduce her more formally, I do want to take care of a little bit of business. As you know, the Humanities Center has many events, and if you'd like to find out about them via email, we have a list that you can sign up for, and you'll get a weekly update about what's happening and other activities in the humanities that we haven't organized. There will be a question and answer period after the lecture, and I also have to make a number of thank yous. I'd like to thank the many people and organizations that have made tonight's event possible. In particular, I'd like to thank Sophia Akert, I don't know, oh, there you are, right over there, who has made tonight's event possible, as many of you have heard from her personally, as well as Tim Blanton and Maddie Collins. Maddie's over there, and I think Tim is here, who are our graduate coordinators at the center and work very hard to make all of these events work. And we'd like to thank Shared Services as well for processing all the financial transactions that have to happen to get things to happen. So other co-sponsors, sorry, I'm not doing well tonight. Other co-sponsors in our series include the Rothman Endowment at the Center for the Humanities and the Public Sphere, the Office of Research, the College of the Liberal Arts and Sciences, HESCA over in the School of Art and Art History, the Smathers Libraries, of course, where we are this evening, the Department of History, the Center for Latin American Studies, the Department of Spanish and Portuguese, the Department of Religion, the College of Veterinary Medicine, the Alachua County Library District, the Digital Worlds Institute, and the Honors Program. So finally, after many months of planning, it's my pleasure to introduce our distinguished guest, who faced many travails as she passed through Atlanta last night during the storm, and they finally located her luggage this afternoon. So we're glad that things have finally worked out. Professor Ellen Amster is the Jason A. Hanna Chair in the History of Medicine, and she's jointly appointed in the Department of Clinical Epidemiology and Biostatistics and in History at McMaster University, which is in Hamilton, Ontario. After receiving both a Fulbright Scholarship and a Chateaubriand, which is sponsored by the French Consulate, she received her PhD in History from the University of Pennsylvania. As a historian of the Islamic world, France, and medicine, Professor Amster's research addresses the relationship of the citizen bodies to the body politic, the history of biomedicine in a global context, religion and science, birth and maternal health, the body as the center of political sovereignty, and the encounter of French and Islamic scientific epistemologies. She's been a simultaneous translator for an Orbis ocular surgery mission in Morocco, a researcher at the Institut National de Hygiène du Maroc, and she also created a determinants of health field study program for students in Morocco. Which is called Maternal and Infant Health in Morocco, Women's Rights and Family in Islam. Her 2013 book is called Medicine and the Saints, Science, Islam, and the Colonial Encounter in Morocco, 1877 to 1956, which is an interdisciplinary study of health, healing, and the body in Morocco, both in the pre-colonial and during the colonial period. And her interests range, as you've heard, very, very widely. Her recent projects have included work on transvestites in French North Africa, midwifery and gynecology in the Islamic world, digital histories of medicine, Judeo-Islamic scientific exchange, and an interdisciplinary approach to contemporary issues in healthcare, the cultural experience of illness and birth, midwifery, and infant health in North Africa. So without further ado, I hope that you'll join me in welcoming Professor Ellen Amster, who will speak this evening on A Doorway to the Divine, Islamic Bodies and Sufi Saints as Connecting the Living to the Dead. Thank you.
Thank you for that fantastic set of introductions. I am very impressed with University of Florida and very excited to be here, especially as I had an Africanist thesis advisor. So I've been very, very influenced by African studies methodologies. It's a very important part of my thinking. I'm going to ask if it's possible to lower the lights so that we can see the slides. Oh, okay, awesome. So thank you, Bonnie, and the Center for the Humanities and the Public Sphere for your kind invitation to come to University of Florida, and thank you for this challenge. So I'm a historian of medicine, and I thought, what can I say about death? Is death what happens when medicine doesn't work out? What is it I can say about death? So my book is this. I hope this isn't sufficiently shameless here. My book, Medicine and the Saints, is about the social history of disease, municipal health, the history of medical practitioners and institutions, obstetrics and gynecology, pharmacy and pharmacology, but also about traditional medicine and how French and Islamic medical systems interact. And I deal with a number of questions. One of them is, what happened when a biomedical system was introduced to Morocco? This isn't to say that there weren't biomedical physicians before 1912, but it was the first large-scale public health system. So what happened during the French Protectorate Health Service, because Morocco was a protectorate of France from 1912 to 1956? And then what's the impact of that? What's the outcome? So one big question is medical pluralism and medical syncretism, or why patients shop between different medical systems and mix medicines looking for cure. So traditional medicine in Morocco is in part Galenic, and this is a Galenic pharmacy for the most part. You see even in this Galenic pharmacy a mix of medicines. The apothecary has biomedical models to show the patron what plants will operate on which organs, and he has his diploma for his medical authority. Galenic medicine, you may be familiar with, is predicated on the four humors. This is an example from a European text. So sickness is imbalance and treatment is restoring balance. But there's another kind of traditional healing in Morocco that involves visiting saints, and especially saint graves, to be healed. And the seeker can sleep in the shrine or drink water from the shrine or use earth from the grave, either to eat it or for other purposes. So I thought, why and how do Islamic saints heal people? Saint healing can be through a living or dead saint, but if we take a step back and look at this, this is a grave. So here, look, there's some dead people. So saint healing is often living people visiting dead people to ask for cure from sickness and affliction. And then when I think about it, there is an Islamic concept to die before you die. This is a hadith of the Prophet, so a thing that the Prophet said during his lifetime. And there are two poems by a prominent medieval woman saint that I wanted to use to illustrate this idea, Rabia al-Adawiya. The first is, I am the murderer of joy, said the angel of death, the widower of wives, the orphaner of children. Why always run yourself down, said Rabia. Why not say instead, I am he who brings friend and friend together? So that death is not the great divide. Death is that which brings the seeker and God together. And the notion is of the lover and the beloved, that the lover seeks the beloved, God is the beloved, and that it is a friend and a friend. Another poem, ironic, but one of the most intimate acts of our body is death. So beautiful appeared my death, knowing who then I would kiss. I died 1,000 times before I died. Die before you die, said the Prophet Muhammad. Have wings that feared ever touched the sun. I was born when all I once feared I could love. So what does that mean? Right? When you die, you'll meet God. So you want to meet God before that, before your biological death. So what does that mean to die before you die? What is it that's going to die? It's your ego, your self. And this, I think the Islamic studies people are all going to laugh at me trying to explain this very quickly in a short period of time, but I'm using what Sufis generally do, which is poems to illustrate very complex ideas. And this is a Rumi poem. A certain person came to the friend's door and knocked. Who's there? It's me. The friend answered, go away. There's no place for raw meat at this table. The individual went wandering for a year. Nothing but the fire of separation can change hypocrisy and ego. The person returned, completely cooked, walked up and down in front of the friend's house, and gently knocked. Who is it? You. Please come in, myself. There's no place in this house for two. The doubled end of the thread is not what goes through the eye of the needle. It's a single-pointed, fine-down thread end, not a big ego beast with baggage. So to die before you die is to master and discard the ego. And the world is not a trap or an enemy, but it is a place where one matures and is cooked, right? So if you think about how you viewed life at 19 versus how you view life at 80, right? You have a different experience. And in fact, it's the suffering of the world. This is not uniquely Islamic concept, but it's the suffering of the world and the experience in the world that gives some insight. So here's a wrinkle for you. These Islamic saints are also political. Sufi saint shrines are now under attack by Islamic positivists, so-called Salafi Islamist groups. These Salafis seek to redefine the Islamic body politic by destroying Sufi shrines in Tunisia, attacking the mausoleum of 333 saints in Timbuktu in Mali, and especially by burning manuscripts, the Islamic knowledge of the 14th and 15th centuries. ISIS has destroyed shrines across the Islamic world, from Pakistan to Libya. And I just wanted to draw attention to an interesting quote from The Guardian. This lady who was taken to the hospital said that the bomb went off when she was watching devotional dancing. And she says, the terrorists are targeting us just because they hate our shrines, she said. They attacked another shrine a couple of months ago, but we will never give up our faith. In Libya, the body of a saint was actually dug up and stolen from his grave. So why is the dead body of a saint so threatening? Notice that this destruction revolves around two elements: epistemology, here the destruction of knowledge and manuscripts, and the body. It's not, as the media would suggest, a simple puritanical intolerance. It is a war to define the nature of truth, of memory, and thus the body politic, or the umma, the Islamic community, which is a word that's sometimes now used to mean the nation. It is a political battle being fought in and through the human body. One does not have to be a saint to have a body with political meaning. When we consider the Arab Spring, we saw many examples of human bodies as the forum for political debate. Not just the dead body as evidence, like the bodies of murdered children laid out to bear witness against the Assad regime most recently. We saw corporeal politics demonstrating that the body and the body politic are intertwined. They reproduce each other. They are mutually constitutive, as African historian Jean Komaroff has said. New political communities mobilized themselves around images of the brutalized corpses of the child Hamza al-Khatib in Syria. So this is what launched the revolution in Syria, for those that don't know. The torture and death of this little boy, this 13-year-old boy who was scooped up by the army, and his mutilated corpse was released back to his parents. There had been bullet wounds in it. His penis had been hacked off. There are all kinds of horrible signs of him being tortured. And in many ways, the Syrian population was like, well, if they're going to do this to a child, what's left? Like, what are we waiting for, right? Like, there's nothing left. And so this group reconstituted itself as a polity, like, we are Syria. And who are we? Who are we as Syria? We are all Hamza al-Khatib. And what's interesting is this cartoon in which the Syrian people is embodied as Hamza al-Khatib, kind of returned from the dead here, like holding his shirt open, the blood from his wounds, and he's reaching out to capture Assad, who's running away from him. And then this is, he was such a powerful political symbol that the regime shelled his grave. So this is his tombstone that's been broken by mortar fire. And the same thing happened with a young man in Egypt called Khalid Said, who was beaten to death in broad daylight, that he also became the point of mobilization. We are all Khalid Said. And then this is an electoral poster in which he represents the electorate corporealized. We also found citizens speaking through their bodies. The death that launched the Arab Spring was that of the Tunisian Mohamed Bouazizi, who burned his own body before the presidential palace to indict a regime incapable of providing food, work, and housing, incapable of supporting the citizens' physical survival. The opponents of Gaddafi's regime broke into his family crypt and dug up the bones of Gaddafi's mother and burned them. Oh, why? Why is this happening? Because sovereignty exists through the body. Sovereignty of the person and sovereignty of the body politic. I realize that what my work shows is that death is not necessarily a divide. The living are connected to the dead. They seek healing and memory and identity and God through the dead. But what is it that's connecting them? How are they connected? The body, I would suggest, is a kind of doorway, even of the living to the dead. But why don't we see this? Or why can't we see this? So Bruno Latour would argue that we don't see this because modernity is a kind of paradigm. By definition, we separate nature from culture and biology from society. So we cut society off from nature, so we imagine ourselves as these free citizen subjects able to determine our own destinies and not determined or held back by biology. Our modern framework makes hybrid realities unseeable, in which we can only know the human body as an individual, biological, and finite entity. And we build a model of citizenship on this fallacy. We treat the citizen as the mind, a collection of legal rights abstracted from the biological body. You have a right to equal protection under the law, but no right to eat or to work or to medical care, no right to survive as a biological organism. This liberal model of sovereignty, invented in the West and adopted across the Middle East and North Africa, is in manifest crisis. But to see beyond this modern paradigm is difficult, or to imagine politics in a different way. A place to begin is with bodies and healing. Bodies are repositories for epistemologies that defy a modern scientific understanding. Traditional healing practice often doesn't make sense. And this shows us that there are realities that are just outside our frame of vision. In 1999, I interviewed a 95-year-old Moroccan lady in the city of Fez, who explained to me that God's election and her blood descent from the Prophet Muhammad gave her barakah, God's blessing, which allowed her to deliver babies, heal the sick, and preserved her from illness. At the same time, she described falling down with typhus fever in the 1940s and showed me the cataracts spreading in her eyes. And I thought, how can one person be both healthy and sick, impervious and diseased? It's right here, with bodies and healing that don't make sense, that we should look for history and politics. If it sounds like I am suggesting a connection between a 95-year-old grandma with cataracts and ISIS blowing up Sufi shrines, that is exactly what I am suggesting. The body is intertwined with society. The body is an archive where we remember other ways of knowing. The body carries a history of a long political and epistemological war to define human being and social reality. And yet my body is me. It is the origin place of me. As phenomenologist Maurice Merleau-Ponty writes, the body is my point of view on the world. I am the absolute source. My existence does not stem from my physical and social environment. Instead, it moves out towards them and sustains them. This is Descartes, by the by, which is something we can talk about in Q&A. So my body is me. Without my body, where is the me? If my body dies, where am I? So how do we disentangle the many pieces here? What I propose is to study a history of saint healing in medicine in Morocco to figure out how these pieces fit together and what changed with French colonialism. We investigate a different way of knowing, an Islamic knowing that connected the living to the dead. This was also a form of politics that existed in Morocco before colonialism and the nation state. A pre-colonial polity is difficult to imagine, but if we combine sources and methodologies that don't usually go together, oral history, medical fieldwork, Sufi hagiography, colonial archival work, alternate ways of knowing become visible. We then consider how French positivism influenced Morocco. First, when Moroccans adopted French science in a self-imposed effort to create modernity, and then a French-imposed colonial medicine. The Islamic world has adopted the divided mind-body modern citizen, but how has it ended? We conclude with healing to understand how people ingest and digest this epistemological struggle. So first, let's locate ourselves in space with a map. I always like to know, like, where is this place you're talking about? So here's Morocco, right across from Spain. Everyone should go to Morocco. That's my first thing. It's the best place ever. Okay. So I'm going to talk a lot about this place, Fez. This is an origin place of much of the story. So here's a quick overview. I learned this from health science. We got our bullet points. We will consider who is a saint, the saint as a place, why people visit saint graves, how do saints heal, how did saints function in the city of Fez, what did the French think of Moroccan saints, and how did positivism come to Morocco and what were the consequences. So let me tell you a story from the history of Fez, a hagiographical narrative familiar to scholars of Sufism. In the year 1623, after a failed revolt against the Sultan Abdullah II, the city of Fez feared his vengeance and sent 2 mad saints to intercede on its behalf. When the Sultan received the 2 saints, he scoffed. The people of Fez couldn't find any to mediate for them but these 2 shitters in their rags. Angry, the saints replied, "By God, you will not have a free hand in Fez for 41 years," and departed. Suddenly, the Sultan's stomach reversed, and he vomited feces from his mouth for several days, until he sent for the saints and begged their pardon. No Sultan ruled in Fez for the period the saint had predicted, until God brought the Alawid Sultan Rashid. And this story is true, concludes the court historian al-Ifrani, for I heard it from many people, and I summarize what was told to us. This is the Islamic saint in Morocco. So this word saint isn't accurate. This is something that came from the European context. So what is this Islamic saint? He's a wali or he's a murabit. So a wali is a friend of God, the people of God's right hand. The word wali also means guardian. Murabit literally means he who binds or connects. So he who binds or connects men to God. And in French, it's corrupted to this marabout. That's what marabout is. So This word, the translation of wali to saint is something that came from French visitors to North Africa who watched Muslim pilgrims visiting Islamic awliya for healing from a variety of physical, mental, and social afflictions, touching their bodies and graves, swallowing their saliva, sleeping in their tombs, and performing healing at the shrine. So here's an example. Sidi Harazim, which is actually, his real name is Hirizim, so it's been corrupted a little bit. And this is near Fez. Hirizim, he was a jurist in his lifetime. And there's this mineral spring that pilgrims drink for relief from a variety of urinary issues and digestion. You can go today to Sidi Harazim. There's actually a corner of the park near it where people urinate into a bottle to see if anything has come up. And they call that corner laboratoire. Just thought I'd add that. It's pretty cool. So what makes a person an Islamic saint? At its simplest, sainthood is knowing. So the knowers of God, al-Arifun, are a folk who work righteousness. Thus they are freed from material constraints. They die. When they die, they come back to God and live again. When they live, they speak with the living who never dies. So essentially, the saint is a knower. So what is it that he knows? I'll tell you. So here's an example of what he knows from Rumi. Not Christian or Jew or Muslim, not Hindu, Buddhist, Sufi or Zen, not any religion or cultural system. I am not from the east or the west, not out of the ocean or up from the ground. I do not exist. I'm not an entity in this world or in the next. My place is placeless, a trace of the traceless, neither body nor soul. I belong to the beloved, have seen the two worlds as one, and that one call to and know, first, last, outer, inner, only that breath, breathing human being. So the word for soul is nafs, which is very close to nafas, to breathe. So what is it you are? What is it the human being is? At the very core, it's when God breathes into earth and made Adam. So that's what you are. You're the breath of God. And so when you really know that, then you transcend the material world. Then that's why there's miracles, and you can speak, you can tell the future, and you can heal people, because you see the place where the divine and the material come together. And the place where they come together is in the human body. Human beings are that composite of the divine and the material. The worlds meet inside the human being. So as Scott Kugel writes, the human body bears God's signs, al-Ayat. So ayat are in the Qur'an, and then they're also in the horizons, and then there's also in human beings. The Qur'an tells us, we shall show them our signs in the horizons and in themselves. Several verses of the Qur'an tell us that the body will testify to God on the day of judgment, even against the soul. One day, God's enemies will be ushered toward the fire, distraught and bewildered. As they approach it, their hearing and vision and skin bear witness against them, revealing what they had been doing. They address their skins, "How can you bear witness against us?" They answer, "God has caused us to speak, as God causes all things to speak. For God created you in the first instance, and you return inevitably to God." Saints can heal because they see the reality of the human being as the meeting place of divine and material worlds. The human body is an isthmus between the oceans of God and the cosmos. This direct knowledge of God came to different people at different times. Women, beggars, sultans, physicians, craftsmen, jurists, and others, which manifested as supernatural phenomena. Miraculous healing, flying in the air, and revealing the unseen world. Islam has no canonical church to codify or regulate its miracles, and indeed miracles are often frowned upon by legal scholars. But it's the Moroccan public who validated Islamic saints by acknowledging their miracles and visiting their bodies in life and after death. Saintly knowing was thus potentially revolutionary, for it provided a means to challenge the Sultan's political legitimacy and was validated by the public in visitation. Muslim saints sometimes became political leaders. Miracle-working saints have contended with the sultans for power, waged war, even created states. like the saintly al-Murabids and al-Muhads. So al-Muravid is a corruption of al-Murabitin, the marabouts. That's what the al-Muravids are. But most saints were very local figures. That's not a saint. That's my former Arabic teacher who teaches at the Qarawiyyin. But he looks very nice and he has an umbrella. In Morocco, the saints have been called tent stakes because they brought God's law and God's grace down to earth with their human personalities. But I argue it is their human bodies that allow a physical opening for God's grace in the world, very similar to something that you had been speaking of. Unlike the Christian rejection of the flesh, so we could talk about that later, the Muslim body can be a vessel for God's love, according to the prophetic hadith. Nothing draws my servant near to me like the performance of what I prescribe for him as religious duty. Then my servant continues to draw nearer to me by supererogatory acts until I love him, so that when I love him, I become the ear by which he hears, his eye by which he sees, his hand by which he grasps, and the foot by which he walks. Thus by me he hears, by me he sees, by me he grasps, and by me he walks. If he asks me for something, I certainly give it, and if he seeks refuge with me, indeed I protect him. So the Wali's body becomes like a kind of opening in the world where one might access God's blessing, which is why pilgrims are touching saints' bodies for healing. Not because the saint is going to do something. It's not the saint who acts in this principle. It's that the saint is merely an opening in the world. At the same time, saints' tombs were a means for Moroccans to remember history and give political legitimacy. The dead buried body is how a person becomes a place. So geographically, the saints literally anchored a floating map of history in the Moroccan landscape through their bodies. As Christian pilgrims might read the Bible in the stained glass pictograms of cathedrals, so Moroccans could read a history of God's presence in the world by visiting the graves of his saints. And in pilgrimage, Moroccans connected discrete moments in historical time into a kind of map of the past, a public history that the sultans tried to manipulate by building and destroying building on saint graves. And to illustrate this, we consider a short history of the graves of Idris I and Idris II. The grave of the founder of the Islamic State in Morocco, Idris I, on Zarhoun Mountain, became a rallying point for the political ambitions of his descendants, the Idrisid dynasty. The Idrisids lost power in 921 AD to Berber dynasties, like the Marinids, who had no blood tie to the Prophet, and thus an insecure claim to power. So the Idrisids are blood descendants of the Prophet. Trying to force the Sultan to forget the Idrisids, trying to force the people to forget the Idrisids, the Berber Marinid Sultan, Uthman II, used his armies to chase pilgrims away from Idris's grave, as a court historian recounted. Idris, may God be pleased with him, was buried outside the gate of Walili, and the people have been determined to visit his grave. There they cry out their needs to God and are heard by him. His body appeared in its shroud in the year 718 Hijri. So people streamed to it from every part of the Maghreb, causing fears of a riot. Our Lord, Abu Sa'id Uthman bin Yaqub bin Abdul Haq, this is the Marinid Sultan, may God accept his deeds, sent an army to drive them away from that place and to put an end to the disturbances. To build their own legitimacy, the Marinids discovered the unblemished corpse of his son, Idris II, 500 years after his death, miraculously untouched by decay, which they reburied in a magnificent shrine in the city of Fez. This mosque shrine became a center of visitation, and Idris II, or Moulay Idris, became the patron saint of Fez. So here's Fez, and then here's Moulay Idris. Here he is, right here. So despite the Sultan's efforts, the Moroccan people used the saints to construct history for themselves. Oral traditions across Morocco recount that as the Idrisids fell from power, an Idrisid child fled to their region and found refuge with a local family. Over time, the family all became known as saints, as a French ethnographer recorded in 1911. At the moment of the persecution of the Idrisids by Musa ibn Abi al-Afiya in 317, a sheriff Idrisi, who was still a child, pursued by enemy soldiers who wanted to kill him, took refuge in the house of a Baqal of the Ghazawa. Summoned by the pursuers to hand over the young Sharif, the Baqal, to save a descendant of the Prophet, gave one of his own sons to the soldiers. Later, after the persecution of the Idrisids ended, the Baqal revealed to the Sharif, whom he raised with his own sons, his real origin. The Awlad al-Baqal quickly became the object of veneration of all the people of the country. So this story reveals a merging of the physical body and the body politic in a kind of tree, branching from Fez to Moroccan cities and tribes, bringing the Prophet's blessing to local lineages. The tree is an image of the Sufi chain of spiritual authority. And this I thought was interesting. This is actually from the cover of a story about this particular Sufi saint, who is both descended from the Prophet and a Sufi. So he's got two trees. He's got this blood tree, and then here are the names of all the tribes in Morocco descended from him. And then this green tree is the tree of his Sufi knowledge. Of his disciples. And it was some art historians who made me stop and look more closely at it. I was like, a tree. Okay, now we move on. They're like, but why two colors? And I'm like, and then I'm like, read your sources carefully. Thank you, art historians. So the people used the generative body of Idris II to join the Sufi tree of knowing with the Prophet's family tree. And an actual tree grows from the grave of Idrisid and axial saint Absalam ibn Mshish, whose tree we just saw, whose shajara we just saw, a literal and metaphorical expression of his spiritual power. So we can think about the body as a connector with roots in the earth, in death, in the past, a trunk in human society, and branches in heaven. So how does all of this become actual healing practice? I want to share with you a set of interviews I did in a state clinic in Fez in 1999. And I spoke with 4 elderly gentlemen, all local residents of Lamtine neighborhood. And you should definitely interview old people because it's hilarious. And old people have so much to say, and they shoot right from the lip, and they hold nothing back, and they're awesome. Like, I wish everyone was as awesome as these guys. So first we began with a rousing critique of today's health service and its many failures. And then one man volunteered that his family cures boozaloom, a shooting pain from the base of the spine down the leg caused by a blocked artery in the leg or a constriction of the intestines. He said, we have an illness because we are shurafa, descendants of the Prophet. And our ancestor is Sidi Yahya, the son of this Mullah Idris. He is our ancestor. And we have a wahmi illness, which is a spiritual or psychological. They call it boozaloom. We cure it. It strikes here, in this joint here. To treat boozaloom, the patient must visit the tomb of Sidi Yahya in the Sanhaja region and consult one of his descendants from the Azami tribe. Each patient has his plant in the open countryside, which lights up the night like burning embers to the Azami, who mark it with ashes or wheat chaff. The next day, the Azami return to the plant and cut its stem, cutting the vein for the patient. At dawn, we get up and go out to that plant. We spend the night with it. We say we are going to cut boozaloom by means of it. To so-and-so, for example, we put that plant in front of us and we read al-Fatiha, which is the opening of the Qur'an. They say, in the name of God, the Beneficent, the Merciful, praises to God, to the end of the verse. Then we say, I cut it for so-and-so, son of, whatever your mother's name is, and they cut that stem with a knife, and he is cured by the permission of God. And when I asked them why that works, the answer was a history of Morocco. Why does that thing work? What do you mean? What is the means? How does it work? That barakah, blessing. Our grandfather, he is Sidi Yahya, the son of Mullah Idris, because Mullah Idris II left 12 sons. It is a historical question. When the rule of the Idrisids disappeared, the Idrisids began to escape. Our ancestor escaped to this area, here to the region of Tawanat, to one mountain. There he lived, there he had children. There is still a tribe. How big? Big. It is called the Shurafa Azamiyin. Oh, I started to think of the body as an archive. This is 1,000 years of history in a healing narrative. Consider, the Idrisids fell from power in 921 AD. The Marinids were chasing pilgrims away from Idris I in 1318 AD. In 1911, a French ethnographer collected that oral tradition about the sons of Idris II scattering all over the country and marrying with the Baqal. And then in 1999, I find a cure by one of these lineages which draw blessing from their long-dead ancestor and his burial sites. So the cure works because of history. That's why you should study history, because history will cure you from all your ailments. So the cure reconnects layers of reality otherwise fragmented for the patient in temporal life. Politics, geography, history, the soul, the body, and God. Healing is how we integrate this multiplicity into one story, our story of our life and its meaning. Consider the function of this cure. Through the saint, the patient accesses barakah, the mercy of God, and is healed. The place of the healing is Taunet Mountain, and the sufferer can access barakah here because the saint's buried body is an opening, a doorway in the world. Through the cure, my individual story of my illness connects to the larger history of Morocco and to the Prophet Muhammad himself. I become part of that story, and that story is part of me. And the body is the connector. To understand how saints operated in society, I turn to the city of Fez and a 19th century 3-volume hagiographical compendium of the Moroccan scholar Muhammad ibn Ja'far al-Kattani, Kitab Salwat al-Anfas wa Mahadathat al-Akyas biman uqbira min al-Ulama wa al-Sulaha bi Fez. I hope that was good because my Arabic TA is in the audience. Some things to know about death and burial practices. Most people in Fez were buried outside the city walls in cemeteries. Only special people get to be buried inside the city walls, the awliya and the Sulaha. These are in al-Kattani's text, and there's about 1,000 of them. In al-Kattani's text, the saints protect the city and its inhabitants, opening between the divine and material worlds with knowledge. They mediate the city's ecosystem, causing rain to fall and plants to spring from the earth. If there were no pious persons, afflictions would flow forth onto the people of the earth like an inundation, and the people would be blind like beasts. In Fez, science wells forth from the chests of its people as water springs forth from its walls. This began with Idris II, a Mohammedan figure who called upon God to make Fez a house of knowledge and law. Through him, the people of Morocco learned, all of which they had been ignorant. In space, Idris's body merges literally with the city's space. His buried body is like the beating heart of the city, and the canals of the river Fez become his circulatory system. A Fez resident told me that when he put his legs into the pool of water at the Bu Inaniya Madrasa, blessing or barakah from Idris II cured him of typhus. And it works very quickly, like magic, and my Lord gives me life. And here I am standing up, my daughter. A French physician in the 1930s, who was the médecin chef at that hospital I showed you, Cocard, recorded a cure at the tiny water spout projecting from the Mullah Idris shrine. An inscription in Kufic characters engraved on the cup indicates that the fountain is a habus property of Mullah Idris. The patient takes the cup with the right hand, says, "In the name of God," drinks 3 swallows of water and thanks God. Then he recites, "May the blessing of this water of venerated Mullah Idris expand in me. May God accord it to me, cure me, and give me good health. May the will of God be done, of God the healer." The patient lights an olive oil lamp next to the fountain called Manara. If the patient can't be transported, his family takes a bottle of water from Bab Lufa, which he drinks, then rubs the area of his body where the problem is. So here's Bab Lufa here, which now has this brown door over it. You can't get the water anymore. But over that little door it says, "Drink here and wrath disappears. Become skilled by the name of God in visitation and prayer." So here's Fez. Sorry, the map is not fabulous. It's not so clear. But if we look at Fez over time, The urban space resembles an organic being, growing and changing with the souls buried in its streets. A buried saint body may grow into a shrine, a mosque, a Sufi lodge, or an entire city quarter. The body of Sidi Ahmed al-Shawi has become a city quarter. So you have here this sign that tells you that it is the street of Sidi Ahmed Shawi. Here it says the quarter of Sidi Ahmed Shawi. Here's the doorway to his shrine, and on the lintel of the door it says, "If life only lasted for 1 hour, spend it in obedience to God." A saint may become a community mosque, which is what happened to Sidi al-Khayat. It tells you also that saints don't have to be fancy, because al-Khayat is the tailor. Well, Sidi al-Khayat is Sir the tailor. So this is the al-Khayat mosque from outside. And Sidi Qasim bin Rahmun became a zawiya or Sufi lodge, which literally grew. He was buried in the ground and then in this room, and then his followers bought the house next door, and then they demolished the wall, and then they pray in it, and then it's a zawiya, becomes a zawiya. So the Salwa describes the city of Fez in a spiral. So the text itself is not organized in time. It's not organized chronologically or by the names of the people. It's organized in space. It's organized geographically. And it's organized like this, in a spiral, in a pilgrimage route, if you're going to walk in Fez. The pilgrimage route starts at the grave of Idris II and revolves through the city neighborhoods. Idris is thus the literal qutb, the spiritual, geographic, and cosmological axis connecting earth to heaven, around whom the city literally turns. And now you'll see this amazing animation that I created that illustrates this important point. That's called digital humanities. The Salwa is thus organized according to a cartographic imaginary different from a map, because it is a world organized by the spiritual energy of the saints buried in the earth. Al-Kattani writes of the saint as a refuge for those who fear and adore to God on earth, who enlivens the hearts of men by permission of the all-hearing and the all-seeing. The saints perform many amazing miracles in Al-Kattani's text, but it is knowledge that illuminates the visitor with their light. What I have tried to show is not reality, but an idea of reality, a pre-colonial way of imagining the polity. What emerges here is an ideal of Fez in which the Sultan has only a limited authority. He is the people's executor, not their sovereign. But this Sufi polity was challenged in the early 20th century when a Moroccan Sultan and his court officials considered a different idea of truth. The court adopted Islamic modernism or Salafiyya, a movement of the late 19th century to reconcile Islam with French positivism. This French and modern way of thinking transformed politics in Morocco. So how about those French? How do they understand Morocco, Islam, and saint healing? So imperialists of the French Third Republic saw Islam as the opposite of their civilization. Ernst Renan declared in his 1883 address that Islam had killed science. In killing science, he wrote, Islam killed itself and condemned itself to a complete inferiority in the world. Well, that's kind of a bummer. These imperialists drew on the positivism of Auguste Comte. So to be fair to Auguste Comte, he was no imperialist. In fact, he thought that the French had done such a bad job in Algeria, they should let them go and let them go back to being independent, because he said, made such a hash of it. So he was not an imperialist, but he did create a single epistemological system that negated other kinds of knowing, that made other kind of knowing invalid. He imagined the physical and the moral as levels of a single system, from the simplest to the most complex order of reality. So first there's math and then astronomy, and every layer of reality obeys all the natural laws of the layer that came before. And the highest level is sociology, or the science of society. And people evolved through history to an understanding of this fact. Thus, first, a society's approach to the physical world showed their degree of cultural progress. A people matured until they realized that God did not exist. Society was the highest reality. Comte wrote, in a word, humanity definitively substitutes herself for God, without ever forgetting his provisional services. Comte thus reduced religion to social phenomena and subverted the human being to the laws of nature. But in Morocco, the Islamic saints who interested the French were political leaders, like the Sufi leader Ma el-Ainin al-Qaldami, who fought the French in Mauritania, and his son al-Hiba, dramatically portrayed here in the two-penny French popular press, Le Petit Journal, who resisted them in Marrakesh. To understand Moroccan politics and to provide a plan for French invasion, the French Ministry of Foreign Affairs sent the Durkheimian sociologue Edmond Dutey on 5 secret missions to Morocco between 1900 and 1907. He was the first Arabist editor of L'Année Sociologique. Dutey argued that the key was healing. Key to understand Moroccan politics was this healing, the thaumaturgy of the saints. Moroccans, he said, were primitives inhabiting a magical universe of demons, emotional projections of the savage mind. The Islamic saint was a human fetish, like the gree-gree of the African witch doctor. His so-called healing was nothing but a transference by magic, as the primitive would rub a rock on the place where he thought his illness was and then cast that rock away. So the saint's job was to absorb the maladies of society physically into his body. So that's why all these people wanted to touch him, was to transfer their sickness into the saint. Dutey wrote, the bodies of the saints become receptacles for the ills of the community. And then here's one of the many examples of this is, for example, when you can't build on the grave of a saint and you're in the country, you make this kerkour. But for him, he thought this was this kind of pile of rocks of people who had thrown away their thing. And he wrote these very important books, Magic and Religion in North Africa, and then these studies of tribal societies en tribu, especially about Morocco area, Marrakesh area of tribes. So France could conquer Morocco by replacing magic with science and saints with real medicine. So what did French doctors think about sainthood? As you can imagine, primarily they objected because they said people who are sick are going to these saints who do nothing for them instead of coming to us and getting real medical care. They didn't like all these people crowding into a saint shrine and said we should install delousing showers so they don't give each other typhus. But they were also repelled by sainthood at an epistemological level. The first director of the French Protectorate Health Service wrote of Sufi prayer as pathology, delirium, and contagion. He wrote in 1913, "These exhibitions disgust me profoundly, and I flee them. I accuse them of perpetuating fanaticism and ignorance, of capturing the soul of the people, preventing them from thinking, which drags them down to the worst kind of servitude." The physician Émile Mauchon, who was murdered by a mob, so don't feel too mad at him, argued that the French hygiene would liberate Morocco from the saints and sorcerers, the enemies of reason who fooled the people with their phony miracles. The saint's prestige reflects the mentality of his dupes in this country, where at every step one fears to offend or step on a devil. French doctors pathologized Islamic mystical phenomena as hysteria and madness. The saint became an ethno-psychiatric type in the insane asylums of Dr. Antoine Poirot, founder of the Algiers School of North African Psychiatry. But on the eve of colonial conquest, we find it's the Moroccan Sultan, not the French, who introduced positivism to Moroccan politics. The Moroccan sultans were in a weak position at the end of the 19th century. After defeats in battle with France in 1844 and Spain in 1860, Sultan Hasan recognized the need for military reform and new science. He sent Moroccan students to study artillery in Belgium, England, France, and Spain, medicine at the French-directed Qasr al-Aini Medical School in Egypt, and he adopted these European military training missions. The Sultan knew very well that these European missions were spies, and they were spies. They were all mapping the cities and figuring out how they could invade from the west, and here they were all spies. But he needed the science. So he played the European powers off of each other. He only let them see a very small part of his army. And then when he really liked someone, like the French doctor Fernand Linares, he separated them from the military mission and incorporated them into his army. So Linares is here in his French and Moroccan military attire. And Linares more or less single-handedly prevented war from breaking out between France, Spain, and Morocco. And then the French eventually pulled him out because they felt he was too sympathetic to the Moroccans. But Sultan Moulay Hassan died in 1894. And this is his young successor, Abdulaziz, who was absolutely no match for the Europeans. He was 20 years old, very inexperienced. They had him for lunch. The country went 100 million francs into debt. He was pressured to sign the ruinous 1906 Treaty of Algeciras. He was unable to repel a series of saint-led rural revolts. He couldn't stop French invasion. And so in 1907, the scholars declared him morally deceased. And the people broke their oath of allegiance to him. So in a similar situation elsewhere in the Islamic world, Islamic scholars began a self-conscious quest for modernity to defend the Islamic world against European colonialism. The two fathers of Islamic modernism developed their ideas in dialogue with French positivism. Jamal ad-Din al-Afghani, who debated Ernst Renan in the Journal de Débat, and the jurist Muhammad Abdu, who tried a grand synthesis between Islamic law and French secular law. This Islamic modernism proved very useful to the Moroccan Sultan, who used this new Islamic modernity to discredit saints, his rivals for political power. So Abdulaziz was succeeded by his ruthless brother Abdul Hafiz, who seized the throne, used positivism to attack saints. He accused the prominent saint Muhammad ibn Abdul Kabir al-Kattani of heresy, so the cousin of the author of my compendium. He said that saintly knowledge was heresy, that it was untrue, that he was misleading the people. He closed the Sufi lodges. The Sultan then redefined death. He had the saintly al-Kattani beaten to death and his dead body dumped into an unmarked grave. The Sultan also asserted himself on living bodies. He had the disciples of al-Kattani's hands cut off and the bloody stumps rubbed with salt so they could survive as a testament to his supreme law and power. But the people didn't like Abdul Hafiz and they revolted against him. Surrounded by his own people in Fez, Sultan Abdul Hafiz called on France to liberate him. He signed away Moroccan independence in the Treaty of 1912, a protectorate agreement that located sovereignty in the person of the Sultan. And this is actually his immediate successor. Here's the Sultan riding in, and the French are performing this submission to the Moroccan Sultan as his kind of obedient hands and feet. But the protectorate agreement repeats over and over again that the sovereign of Morocco is the Sultan and sovereignty resides in the person of the Sultan, and they made him into a kind of Louis XIV that no Moroccan polity had ever given him before. But political saints also failed. The French easily killed Sufi leaders who rose, and Sufi orders eventually cooperated with French authorities. Islamic modernism became the only viable language of resistance and nationalism in Morocco. By the time of the Moroccan independence movement, Moroccan nationalists criticized the French civilizing mission, but defined Moroccan modernity through its categories: positive science, nationalism, and biomedicine. The nationalists demanded biomedicine as a citizen's right and waged a campaign against so-called heretical Sufi practices. Jurists of the Qarawiyyin University petitioned the Sultan to outlaw celebrations of the saints. Nationalist newspapers applauded the prohibition of the contemptible Aisawa and other brotherhoods and their barbaric savage practices, and called saint healing women's superstition and public stupidity. Countries of the Middle East and North Africa embraced parliamentary government and Islamic modernism in the early 20th century. In the 1940s, the extreme economic and social inequities of liberalism produced a backlash across the Middle East, first with a turn to Marxism in the 1950s and the Arab socialist regimes, and secondly with the rise of political Islam and Islamist groups like the Muslim Brothers. If we consider Islamist philosophers, we find an effort to reintegrate the Muslim body to a body politic in a new way. So here is the true appeal of the Muslim Brothers, and also why they want to demolish Sufi shrines. Consider the writings of Sayyid Qutb of Egypt, how Qutb attempted in his Social Justice in Islam to reintegrate the citizen as a body with a new body politic. We have discovered that the nature of Islamic belief about human life makes social justice essentially an all-embracing justice, which does not take account merely of material and economic factors. For Islam does not divide the individual into body and soul, into differing intellectual and spiritual sides. It holds that the values of this life are material and spiritual at one and the same time, and that no division is possible in such a unity. It holds also that mankind is essentially one body, its members mutually responsible and interdependent, a body in which there are no clashing and contradictory groups. So by way of conclusion, what can we say about this overdetermined human body and whether death as a divide? I would like to advocate for a different understanding of the human body than what we have at the moment. We think of the human body as an individual, separate, finite, biological entity, a vehicle for my consciousness, but I want to reconceptualize this human body entirely. So first, the body is the base of the body politic. And this is a universal lesson, not just one in the Islamic context, that in what's happened in the Arab Spring, what's happening now is that politics are broken open in a way that it isn't happening here right now, where it's in the street, it's out of institutions, it's fought in front of your eyes. So with this example, we see the inadequacy of modern liberal citizenship to encapsulate the human being. Political systems that do not allow the biological survival of their citizens are in crisis. By setting fire to himself, Muhammad Bouazizi asserted the illegitimacy of the regime. His public death was a dramatic statement that the physical survival of the citizen is the basis of the social contract. And second, the Muslim body remains a space where politics are imagined and debated. The nation-state is in crisis in several parts of the Islamic world, but explanations that resort to tribalism are unsatisfactory. Take, for example, the Islamic Republic of Afghanistan. The weakness of the state is still measured in election turnout, numbers of recruits for the army, but to understand political legitimacy, consider that shortly after September 11, 2001, a Philadelphia Inquirer reporter found that residents of Kabul were walking outside the city to touch the graves of al-Qaeda fighters. When he asked a mechanic why he did this, the man replied, "Because I heard it cured sickness, and because this government is illegitimate. It was set up by the Americans." And then you have also this note from the Toronto Star in 2008, again about visitation of al-Qaeda graves. Buried here in a corner of the vast and desolate Kandahar cemetery are the al-Qaeda dead, 70 fighters who were killed together in a coalition airstrike. Yesterday, a van crammed with Afghan men came to a gravel-spinning stop at the al-Qaeda plot. Carefully, they removed a lame relative from the vehicle and carried him to the edge of the grave so he could dip his finger in the salt. The crones who hang about the cemetery, it's always women who are the crones, swear to reporters that they have witnessed instant cures. Some days the crowds are considerable. Childless women seeking fruit of the womb, invalids, fathers of mentally disabled boys. They turn to these moldering bones of fallen jihadists as if the place were Lourdes. These healing practices have been marginalized or taken as evidence that the Middle East is somehow an incomplete modernity. But I suggest we pay attention. Healing reveals deep political realities. Healing shows how people envision the polity and locate themselves in it. Healing connects one's own life with political life, one's own story with a larger political story. We need to study politics through the lens of corporeality. If we do, what becomes visible? As for the qutb Sidi Ahmed Zarruq al-Fasi, the saint in Libya whose body was disinterred and stolen from his grave, the destruction of Sufi graves and manuscripts is an act one and the same, an effort to erase alternate Islamic knowledge and to impose a hegemonic idea of truth, reality, and the past. But have these modernists succeeded? Has material positivism replaced the saint as a doorway between the living and God? So I visited Fez and tried to retrace the steps of al-Kattani through the city. So translated the text and then tried to visit all the saints that he mentioned in 2 neighborhoods. And what did I find? Some of the graves, like Sidi Ahmed at-Tijani, who was very important and we heard about earlier, and we must have some photos of him, here he is, are very much alive, very much visited. But others are lost and forgotten. So for example, I followed instructions to Sidi el-Tajibi, and this is what I saw, this shop. There was 2 men sitting in this shop making, I don't know what they're making, something. And I said, excuse me, according to my text, Sidi el-Tajibi should be here. And they say, oh, he's right here. And they open this door in a closet. They say, he's right in here. He's in the closet. I also went to the Zawiya of Ibn Suwal. And today, there's a family that squats in it. And the basin for prayer ablutions is used for laundry. They were doing some laundry in here. But so in many ways, the physical manifestation of barakah has often been forgotten, often been lost. And perhaps this topographical map of a Sufi polity is no longer there. What survives, however, are these fragments and healing narratives. So I want to tell you something that these 4 men told me about the Azami. They told me a story that went like this. A Moroccan doctor studied in France and returned to Morocco to practice medicine in a big office. One day he was struck by bouzaloun, and he tried to cure himself using his medicines. And after getting tired of curing himself with the medicines, the Moroccan doctor traveled to France to have the leg amputated, so that was the only solution to end the terrible pain. One madame in the hospital, which is a nurse, told him, you see, there is no medicine for the illness that you have, but there are marabouts in Morocco who can cure you that illness. I will make an appointment for you, and I will give you the paper, and you will go to Morocco, and you will look for the marabouts. They are the ones who will cure you. And he found my cousin, and they cut that stem with a knife, and he was cured by the permission of God. So even if a barakah is not necessarily present in the same way it was in the 19th century, it is still present in the archive of the body and the ways in which we live our own lives. Thank you for your time and attention.